Today we're going to look into the largest murder inquiry in South Wales, and you'll soon realize why this case is still talked about. But before we get started, welcome to True Crime with Maneater. If you love all things true crime, including missing person cases, cold cases, and just as strange happenings in the world, you've come to the right place. Be sure to subscribe and turn on alerts so you never miss a video upload. Let's get started. In 1999, Mandy Power, who was 34 at the time, was described as having a fantastic personality and just a love for life. She had two daughters, Katie, who was 10, and Emily, who was 8. Not only did Mandy take care of her two daughters, but she also took care of her mother, Doris, who was 80. Doris actually lived with Mandy because Doris had some serious health issues and couldn't take care of herself. So Mandy was her primary caregiver along with her daughters. Simply put, Mandy was just a generous and loving and kind woman. But this would all change on June 27th, 1999. On that evening, after babysitting, Mandy and her two daughters jumped in a taxi and made their way home. It was around 11:48 p.m. when they arrived. Unfortunately, on that night, Mandy, her mother, and her two daughters would all be murdered viciously. Investigators believe that Doris was murdered first. And scientists would actually come to this conclusion because the murder weapon was full of blood and it had Mandy's and Emily's and Katie's, but Doris's wasn't there. So they believe that Doris was beat first, but that murder weapon was used to kill her. They believe that Doris was murdered first since she was home alone, waiting for her daughter to arrive. And then as Mandy came in, her and her daughters were beat to death with a pole. But others aren't so sure about this theory. And it really is quite important to know who was killed first. So while Doris is being murdered, the killer accidentally smashes a light bulb, and because of this, he blew a fuse. So the killer would actually go into Emily and Katie's room, and he saw a TV that was sitting on top of a chair, so he moved the TV. He took the chair, he took it down to the bathroom, and used it as a step stool to fix the fuse. So as I mentioned earlier, it is important to know who was murdered first. And that's because there were multiple suspects, and determining this timeline was crucial to the case. So I want to start by looking at the prime suspects before we dive in any further. Allison Lewis was the principal suspect, and for good reason. Allison was having an affair with Mandy Power at the time, but apparently Allison was a very domineering and jealous partner when it came to Mandy. But the thing is, Allison was married at the time, so she technically wasn't faithful to Mandy in general, or her husband. Her husband's name was Stephen, and he had an identical twin brother who was known as Stuart, and they were both police officers. A witness would later go on to say that Mandy was just one of the boys. She had plenty of casual affairs, she liked to drink and hang out. She was just really happy living her life the way that she was. So Allison herself had been a police officer, but she was placed on disability after witnessing a suicide. Allison went on to play rugby, she was a black belt in karate, and was supposedly known for being an expert in handling weapons that are used in martial arts. So these three were really the obvious suspects: Allison, her husband Stephen, and his brother Stuart. Allison was jealous and possessive of Mandy, and I'm sure she definitely did not approve of Mandy having other relationships. And then we have Stephen, whose wife is cheating on him with another woman, which could have enraged him and made him jealous enough to kill her. And of course, Stuart, being his brother's identical twin, could have helped and covered it up. Obviously, Mandy seemed far less stressed about the relationship than Allison did, which led her to have other relationships. And one of these relationships brings about our next suspect. So David Morris was apparently well known to the police. He had a lengthy criminal record and had served time in prison. He was apparently quite violent and had been violent to his girlfriend at the time. David had been trying to keep out of trouble and was working as a day laborer. And David knew Mandy well because they were having a sexual affair. And David's gold chain was found at the murder scene. But we'll dive into that later. So on that evening, police and firefighters were called to Mandy's home because it was on fire. Eventually, when they got the fire out, they realized that all 4 women were dead and they had severe head injuries. And Mandy had also been sexually assaulted. So of course, police theorized that the fire had been started to destroy evidence. The theory at the time was that the killer had to know the family, or at least Mandy. They said this because there was no forced entry into the home. They also believed that the killer took off their sock and wore it as a glove, obviously so they wouldn't leave any fingerprints or DNA behind. The killer would find a fiberglass pole that belonged to Mandy and would use that to kill all 4 women. As I said earlier, some people believe that Doris was murdered first, but police didn't believe that. They actually believed that Mandy was murdered first, and then the other 3, her daughters and her mother, were murdered, basically so there was no witnesses. A senior investigator at the time would go on to say, there were no financial worries, she was not involved with drugs or criminality, she was a very happy happy, friendly, and likable individual. Why would someone kill Mandy? So in July of 2000, Allison, her husband, and brother-in-law were all arrested. Police basically theorized that Stephen had found out about his wife Allison's affair with Mandy, and this sent him into a rage. Allison and Stephen would tell police that they had an alibi. They were home in bed all night long. But one witness that was interviewed was Mandy's neighbor, Louise. Louise would claim that she heard a man that looked like Stephen and sounded like Stephen shouting at Mandy a few weeks prior to her murder. Supposedly, this man shouted, "Stay away from my fucking wife or I'll fucking kill you."
Stephen Lewis had told the police he knew nothing of his wife's affair, so he had no motive for the murders. But Panorama has discovered the police had other crucial information early on which contradicted that. Within days of the murders, we've learned, the police had been told Stephen Lewis had known of the affair. 2 days after the murders, South Wales police received a phone message. Mandy Power, it said, had been threatened by her lover's husband, and he was a police officer. Detectives interviewed the witness in the pub where he said he'd spoken to Mandy Power. It was just weeks before she'd been killed. The witness told them Mandy said both she and her children had been threatened by the officer. And there were more messages. We've uncovered details of other witnesses who also told the police in the days after the killings that Stephen Lewis had threatened Mandy Power. But it wasn't until almost a year later that police took a further statement from one of Mandy's closest friends when she told them she'd seen Stephen Lewis threaten Mandy.
Steve was standing just on the top of the steps, and he was like that. And then he said, "Go anywhere near my fucking wife again, and I'll fucking kill you." And Mandy was obviously by the door. I came out, came down the steps, came across when Steve had come down the steps when I got to there, by the gate. That weren't there either. And Mandy was on the floor. The door was open. She was on the floor against the wall like that, kneeling down. And the kids were on the top of the stairs crying, you know?
Did you have a clear view of that?
Yeah.
And how sure are you of who it was?
I'm positive.
Allison would apparently say that her husband had been joking and he didn't mean it. And she would also say that he didn't know about the affair at that time. So I do want to pause here and remind everyone that Allison admitted that Stephen had said those things to Mandy, but her claim was that he didn't know about the affair at the time and he was joking. Something about that just sits really, really unwell with me. The neighbor would go on to claim that on the night Mandy died, she was expecting a visit from Allison. Allison would very much deny this and say that she was not going to Mandy's house that night. That evening, Stephen's twin brother, Stuart, was on patrol, and his logbook would go missing. This was a pretty botched case, so there's a lot of information out there that differs. But from what I understand, Stuart actually came up to Mandy's house and saw that it was on fire while he was on patrol. So it's debated whether or not Stuart reported the death of Mandy and her family as suspicious or not. A taxi driver would come forward and say that he saw two men that looked alike walking about a few minutes away from Mandy's house. And this was sometime around 2 a.m. on the morning of the murders. This man, the witness who saw this, he did call the police. They took his details, they said somebody would be in touch, but nobody ever called him back. The same witness would see an image of Stuart and Stephen in the newspaper and call the police again. This man would basically call the police again and say, "Hey, I called once. I saw two men that looked alike walking around close to Mandy's house at 2 a.m. the morning of the murders. And now I've seen their faces, and these two men are the men I saw that night." So basically, this man identified the two people he saw walking very closely to Mandy's home before she was murdered, and police never contacted him. And he called twice to make sure that he reported this. He knew it was a serious tip. The community would become like a mob. They basically hated Allison, they hated Stuart and Stephen. They did everything to make their lives miserable. Anytime they saw Allison out and about, they'd call her a murderer. They basically told her she deserved to die. This town was very upset over the murders of Mandy, and that police officers very well could have had something to do with it. Investigators unfortunately could not find enough evidence to charge Allison, Stephen, and Stuart, so they had to release them. Allison would later say, "They were looking for scapegoats. I believe I was one of those scapegoats. I know I was. There was never any evidence because I'm innocent. I wasn't there. I didn't do it." Two other witnesses besides this taxi driver would come forward. A woman would say she saw a man in dark jeans, a shiny bomber jacket, and he was carrying something under his arm. The woman would tell the police police. She would call them. She'd say, hey, I saw this man around this time. It's very suspicious. A sketch was made, but it was never released. And as you can see by the sketch, it looks quite a bit like Stephen.
He was quite tall, quite stocky, dark cropped hair. He was wearing dark jeans, trousers, and he seemed to me like a shiny bomber jacket. And he was carrying a bundle under his arm, quite a large parcel of some sort or kit bag.
This was only a few dozen yards from the house where Mandy and her family had been attacked and killed. It was after the murders, but before the final fire was lit. He looked at you?
He did, yeah.
And you looked at him?
Yeah.
How far away was he at that point?
A few feet away, looking straight through the windscreen.
The day after the murders, Nicola Williams reported the sighting to the police. Within a week, she'd made an e-fit of the man she'd seen. The police never released it to the public.
What you would expect is for that to be broadcast immediately everywhere because it's your hottest lead. And that's even assuming the police for themselves weren't able to spot the similarity between that e-fit and people who already figured as suspects in the investigation, which frankly one would have thought was obvious to even the most useless detective.
The police didn't have to look far to find someone who resembled the e-fit. One of their own officers, Sergeant Stephen Lewis, the man whose wife had been having an affair with Mandy Power. But if they'd made the connection, the murder team were keeping it to themselves.
The other witness saw a man at 4 a.m. and said that he was wearing dark jeans, a shiny bomber jacket, and had something under his arms. And this man was walking away from Mandy Power's home. This man actually drove past Mandy Power's home after he saw this man and saw that it was on fire. Eventually, police would turn their investigation to David Morris. On the night of the murder, David Morris was drinking in a pub. Evidently, David's story kept changing. David said he would eventually leave the pub and make the 15-minute walk home. He was sharing a home with his girlfriend and her daughter at the time. Basically, David arrived home, he kind of is looking up at the flat, and he decides he's not going to go in. So he told police that he walked around for an hour and a half. He was about 3 miles away from his parents' home and then turned around and headed back to his home that he shared with his girlfriend. He said that he arrived home at around 3 a.m. and his girlfriend woke up, opened the door, and let him in. He would take his supposed wet clothing, place it in the washing machine, and then go to bed. But his girlfriend, Mandy Jewell, said something completely different. She said that David would arrive home at about 10:30 or 11, but she didn't let him inside. And then her story would change and she would say, okay, he came, I did let him in, but I don't know what time it was. So obviously this is going to be suspicious to police because there's two people here. They have differing stories. This man claims he was just walking around for an hour and a half to go to his parents' house. He gets within 3 miles of his parents' home and then turns around and goes back to the home he shared with his girlfriend. His girlfriend can't pinpoint the time that she did or didn't let him in. Her story's changing. Something seems suspicious about this. Earlier, I mentioned that David's gold chain was found at the crime scene, and it was covered in blood. But David would lie about the gold chain belonging to him. That is, until his first trial. He said that he lied about the chain so that he could conceal the affair with Mandy from his girlfriend. Police theorized that the motive for David killing Mandy was the fact that he left the pub, he was drunk, he went there, and Mandy refused to have sex with him. So he became enraged and he murdered her and her whole family. They would also theorize that perhaps Mandy threatened to out him to his girlfriend about the affair they were having. So, of course, in order to conceal the affair, he murdered her and her whole family so nobody could talk about it. Sock at the crime scene, believed to be used by the killer to make sure that they were covering their tracks, linked to David Morris. Apparently there was DNA in there, so they could link David to it. I want to note that David was having an affair with Mandy. He admitted that. Would it be unreasonable for his chain and sock to be there? No. The South Wales police would say the science cannot determine how or when this profile was transferred onto the exhibit. So, although they have DNA, they admit that they don't know when it was there. They don't know if it happened the night of the murder. They don't know if it happened prior to that because he was having an affair with Mandy. And really, that's not enough evidence to convict somebody on, or at least you would think it wouldn't be. So is that linked to the sock? And some of the evidence presented was phone records, the gold chain that was covered in blood left at the murder scene. And after the murders, David Morris went and he bought a new chain. So of course that was used as evidence against him. And then they brought up his interview where he lied in it. But several witnesses would testify that the night David was in the pub, they saw him wearing his gold chain. And obviously the timing of this is really important because Morris said that his chain had broken 2 days prior to the murders and he left it at Mandy's home. David Morris would go on to say, "I wore a different chain that night to the pub." And he would even say, "I left my chain in the kitchen at Mandy's." But that chain had been found in Doris's room and was covered in blood. But it was covered in Mandy's blood. There was also a bloody handprint found at the crime scene, and it was found next to a bunch of videos. It looked like the videos were being rifled through. I'm not really sure why. And a handprint expert called to give testimony about this. And he said that that handprint did not match David's. And interestingly enough, there was DNA found on the murder weapon, but it didn't belong to David. So a profiler working this case said that the killer would have been incredibly angry at Mandy. They said the attack was brutal and simply overkill. But the person doing the profile didn't think that the attack was necessarily planned, considering the murder weapon was something that was taken from the home. They would go on to say that this was deeply personal, the killer knew the home well, and probably had been there many times. David Morris would be found guilty during his first trial, but on appeal, he was let out. And a year later, he was going to be tried again. And during a second trial, he was convicted. And his family and much of the community didn't believe that David committed this crime. They were absolutely furious about the botched investigation and really believed that police were just covering up for their own. Many of them believed that Allison and her husband and brother-in-law were absolutely guilty of this murder. Eventually, David Morris would die in prison, but his family is still trying to get his name cleared. So quite frankly, I'm not sure who committed this crime. Theoretically, 3 police officers, one being a former police officer, would be able to not only cover up this crime, but stage it. So if David Morris had actually left his broken chain at Mandy's home, they could have easily thrown it in blood and thrown it in Doris's room. They could have found the sock at the crime scene and realized, okay, she's having an affair. Maybe they knew about her affair and also use that to kind of try to cover up. As police officers, we can assume they have a deep knowledge of crime scenes and investigation and things like that. And they had motives. Allison's motive was strong because she was jealous, she was very possessive, and her husband's motive was quite strong. His wife was having an affair and he was enraged by this. A witness claimed that she heard him and saw him threatening Mandy. David Morris could have easily committed this crime because he did have a violent past, especially with women. But really, even the forensics, from what I understand, is shaky at best. That sock belonging to David, again, he was having an affair with her. Would it be strange that he left clothes behind, whether intentionally or accidentally? Not really. And even if David Morris committed this crime, was it proven beyond a reasonable doubt in the court? I'm not so sure. But I would love to hear your guys' opinions on this, so pop in the comments below. Let me know if I'm missing anything. As I said, this was a botched investigation, so the information available is just kind of messy. But that's it for today, guys. If you like this video or any other video on my channel, be sure to subscribe and turn on alerts so you never miss video upload. If you have a suggestion for a case, pop in the comments below. And I just want to thank you guys so much for your support. I know that you guys watch my videos and you're commenting, and it just means so much to me. I'm so grateful for you. I'll see you next time.